Hi, this is Chris Converse, and in this episode, we'll look at how nesting techniques in SASS can reduce the amount of CSS that you need to write. In CSS, writing specific selectors requires that you repeat the selector names quite a few times, once for each rule in fact. SASS allows us to nest selectors when writing CSS, and once compiled, the resulting CSS will contain the more verbose rules required by a web browser. And in a future episode, we'll cover a similar technique using less instead of SASS. So to follow along with me in this episode, download the exercise files, get your preprocessor software ready, and let's begin by exploring what's in the exercise files. So in the exercise files, we have an index.html file. This file links to the file called style.css, and this file is actually compiled from our .scss file, which is the SASS CSS form of SASS. Now your preprocessor software will convert the SASS file into the CSS file. So in my workflow, the preprocessor I'm using is called CodeKit. So in my particular files, I have a CodeKit file showing up here, but this file is not included in the exercise files. Of course, if you're using CodeKit, CodeKit will generate this file for you, or you can use any preprocessor software that will convert your SASS file into CSS. So to begin, let's come down here and select index.html, and let's open this in our text editor. So once you have the HTML file open, you'll see in the head area, we have a link to style.css. In the body area, we have a header and an article element. Inside of the article element, we have 3 aside elements. We're going to turn these aside elements into columns, and we're going to use nesting techniques in SASS to reduce the amount of CSS we need to write. Now, if you'd like to see the layout we're working with, you can open index.html in a browser. So we're going to be taking these 3 aside elements here with windmills, museums, and canals, and we're going to turn these into columns. So now let's go back to the exercise files. Let's find style.scss. Let's open this in our text editor. And now in my particular text editor, I can split the screen and look at 2 different files. So what I'm going to do is split the screen, go back to the exercise files, and I'm going to open style.css in the second window. Now I'm doing this so that we can see the CSS rules that will be generated from our SASS file. So I'm going to be working on the left-hand side in the SASS file, but we can see the results in the right-hand side in the CSS file. So in my SASS file, I'm going to scroll all the way down here to the bottom. I put a CSS commenting here that says SASS nesting, so we're going to put our nesting rules below this. And let's start by targeting the article element. So we'll type in article, space, add in our brackets. So now we'll come in here and split this open. And what we want to do is target the aside elements inside of the article. I'm going to hit a tab character just to format this a little bit. And then inside of this article rule, we're going to add an aside rule. So we'll type aside, then a space, put in our brackets. I'm going to split these open, and now we're going to put in some properties that are going to target the aside element. So let's come up here and make sure we're inside of the brackets for the aside. Let's come in here and set a width property. So we'll set the width to 33%. Next line, let's set a float property. We're going to set float to left, add our semicolon. Next line, let's add box sizing. We're going to set this to border box. And finally, let's come in here and set padding. We'll set 15 on the top, 30 on the right, 0 on the bottom, and 0 on the left. Now with these in place, I'm going to hit save. My preprocessor software is going to process the SASS file into a CSS. So now in my text editor, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of the CSS file and notice that we got a rule here with article space aside. So the browser doesn't actually understand nested rules, but again, the SASS file is being processed into CSS. And now if we go back to the browser, hit reload, we can now see the effect of that CSS on those aside elements. So now back in our SASS file, let's target the H2 elements that are inside of the aside. So we're going to nest the H2 selectors inside of the nested aside selector. So let's come in here after padding. Let's hit a few returns. I'll tab this in. Let's type H2, put in our brackets, split this open. Inside of the H2 selector, let's come in here and set a few properties. So we'll set text transform. We're going to set this to uppercase. Next, we'll set letter spacing to 5 pixels. Next, we'll set the padding to 0 on the top, 0 on the right, 8 pixels on the bottom, and 0 on the left. Scroll up here a little bit. And then finally, let's come in here and set border bottom. We're going to set this to a size of 1 pixel. Set the style to solid. And for the color, we'll use RGBA. So RGBA, put in our parentheses. We're going to set 0 for red, green, and blue, which will give us black. Then a comma, then 0.2 for the alpha. Next, we'll target the paragraph elements inside of the aside. So let's get our cursor after the ending bracket for the H2. Let's hit a return. We'll add a paragraph element, put in our brackets. So the paragraph and the H2 are both inside of the aside selector. So for paragraph, let's come in here and just simply set font size. We'll set this to 0.9 ems, semicolon. And again, inside of the aside selector, let's come in here and target the images inside. So IMG, put in our brackets, split these open. And for the image, we're going to set a height. And the height's going to be set to 4.4 ems. Next, we'll set a float property to left. And then finally, let's come in and set the margin to 5 pixels on the top, 13 pixels on the right, 0 on the bottom, and 0 on the left. Now I'll hit save. My SASS file will be converted to CSS. I'm going to scroll down here in the CSS file, and we can see all of the specific selectors that have been created by converting our SASS file to CSS. And then if we go back to the browser, hit reload, we can see the result of all of those CSS rules that were generated. So now when looking at the final compiled CSS, the amount of code generated by SASS exceeds the amount of code that we had to write into the SCSS file. And now if you'd like to learn more about using SASS or less, I'd recommend taking Joe Marini's course entitled CSS with Less in SASS, which is also available here in the library. And so with that, I'll conclude this episode. And as always, thanks for watching.